Greetings from Austin, Texas. Season 4 of The Big Bit Theory is now off and running. Like many of you, we here at the show are deliberating, kind of digesting what came out of President Trump's State of the Union address. This is Bill Culhane. My co-host Jim Ward is still on sabbatical. He's across the pond promoting his work. I'm sure many of you have seen Jim, heard Jim's podcast, Man vs. Yoga. Lauren is not back from Montreal. So in this special edition of TBBT to launch Season 4, it's yours truly kind of flying solo here, but we have added Mr. Ricky Jennings, who's doing the magic behind the glass for this episode. Among the numerous topics discussed by Mr. Trump in that, hour and 20 minutes or so speech was, drumroll, infrastructure. I looked just this morning. In the Bid Prime database, there are hundreds, many hundreds of current infrastructure-related bids. More are needed. That goes without saying. You and I agree, regardless of where you lean, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, none of the above, the U.S. infrastructure clearly impacts anyone living in and or doing business in and or traveling in the U.S. We all use the roads, drink the water. Most use air travel. We all receive goods shipped into ports. You kind of get the idea what I'm talking about. And yes, and a little bit later, I'm going to talk about it some more, but here's a newsflash. There's more to infrastructure than roads and bridges, even though that's what, in the news as of late, right? That's what we always hear people saying, people writing. Infrastructure equals roads and bridges. There's more to it. The media in the U.S. politicians, average everyday people, we've all weighed in on infrastructure. I mean, just take a look at Twitter. Our longtime listeners of the show know that we've covered the subject here. You may remember our visit last May with Greg DiLoretto from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And speaking of ASCE and Twitter, last evening, and it wasn't long after Mr. Trump stepped away from the microphone, ASCE and their current president, Christina Swallow, released a statement, as to be expected, in support of Trump's intentions when it comes to infrastructure. I tell you what, I just mentioned our visit with Mr. DiLoretto. Can you go ahead and cue up number 7? And this is where Greg DiLoretto shares some of his reasoning for addressing the infrastructure problems.
Well, Bill, I want to be optimistic. We've produced
Me too.
We've produced the report. We've been producing it since 1998, every 4 years. We've heard people ran for office this last November. Both presidential candidates ran on a platform of funding infrastructure. Many people ran for Congress on a platform of funding infrastructure. State and local leaders ran on platforms of funding infrastructure. Of course, we're certainly suggesting it's time then to maintain those campaign promises. And if they can, then certainly we see in the next 10 years that our infrastructure would get to a grade of B, which is what the American Society of Civil Engineers recommends. That's a good condition. And if we can do that, we can avoid hits on our economy to the tune of $3.9 trillion in gross domestic product that we will lose if we don't get it to a grade of B. That's the equivalent GDP of Germany today. We'll also see businesses that can save $7 trillion in business sales because we have a fully functioning economy. And we can avoid a loss of 2.5 million jobs in the year 2025 alone because we've invested in our infrastructure and we have gotten that grade of B. So we've maintained our economic prosperity. But really the number I always like to focus on is we have determined that if we fail to do this, if in 10 years you and I are talking and we fail to do it, we're seeing a loss to each American family of $3,400 a year in disposable income because they're having to spend it on car repairs, alternatives to the infrastructure they have, or wasted time and wasted gas. That's $9 a day. Closing that $2 trillion gap would only cost each American family $3 a day.
Again, that was from our May 2017, early in last season, Season 3, our episode with Greg DiLoretto. Speaking of subject matter experts, there is literally, and we do our research before inviting guests onto the show, there is literally not one person in this country, not a single person with as much expertise on the state of U.S. infrastructure as our guest, Mr. Barry LePatner. Look around the internet. Barry has been on this subject for many years. He authored Too Big to Fall, America's Failing Infrastructure and the Way Forward. By the way, there's a link to the book in the description of the episode. Go ahead and check it out. Included in the book, Barry looked at the specifics surrounding that awful August 2007 collapse of the I-35 West Bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Barry is based in New York City. He's the founder of the LePatner and Associates law firm and LePatner Project Solutions. Again, if you look around the internet, he has shared his opinions with a number of television and radio broadcasts. You'll see Fox Business Network, CNBC, and several NPR shows. And incidentally, for a sobering experience, visit saveourbridges.com. That's a website Barry started.
Mr. LePatner, again, thank you for joining us. As you mentioned in our conversation yesterday when we spoke, you've had a very busy day visiting with other news, other media outlets, so we do appreciate your time. And Barry, as I pointed out in the introduction, you have studied the subject of infrastructure for some time. I just mentioned your 2010 book, Too Big to Fall, America's Failing Infrastructure and the Way Forward. I took a glance at your remarks at Mobility 21 back in 2012, which, look at the calendar, that's 5 or 6 years ago. And of course, the problem goes beyond 2012. But in your remarks, you relayed the observation of one person that, quote, "We are driving now without a bumper, without a spare tire, and with the gas gauge nearly empty." Many in our audience, the show's audience here, Barry, they have an understanding of the magnitude of the problem. It's likely that many in our audience have seen the ASC, the most recent report card. I know this is kind of like asking you to eat a watermelon in one bite with a teaspoon, but with no argument from people, what are the more significant problems with U.S. infrastructure right now?
Well, I think it's important for every citizen to understand that our nation, and by that I mean multiple administrations and Congresses, which crosses between Democrats, Republicans, there's no party issue here, have for the past 40 years failed to put in the needed maintenance and money needed just to maintain our roads, our bridges, our dams, our water supply, and our electric grid, not to mention our airports and our ports. There's no citizen in our country who does not understand that if you own a house and you get a small leak from your roof, you rush up and you pay the $500 or so to fix that roof, because if you don't, next year the bill is going to be $15,000. What we have here in our nation and what has been documented by the American Society of Civil Engineers, by every state which is required to report fastidiously on their bridge critical infrastructure, is that we have tremendous perilous conditions on our bridges, on our roads, on our dams, on our water supply. And we are falling behind in this country. You need to only understand that there was a time that the United States was the leader in spending a percentage of its gross domestic product on infrastructure. Today, China spends nearly 9% of its gross domestic product on its roads and airports and bridges and so on, but the United States is now down to 2.6%.
You made a point a moment ago, Barry, and I think it's worth repeating, that oftentimes, and again, I don't profess to have studied this nearly as much as you have and a number of other people have, but when I hear people mention infrastructure, so many times it's roads and bridges. And as we chronicled a few years ago here at BidPrime, bridges are certainly a part of it, and we have a significant problem, but infrastructure is more than merely roads and bridges.
Yes, so it's worth a moment to just hear how badly we're doing on other areas of what's dedicated infrastructure, or you can call it critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
We have 4,000 dams in this country, dams that hold back water, where there are communities downstream right below them, where the condition of the dams has been so much gone beyond the point of failure. In other words, they have substantial cracks. They have not been fixed in many years. That those dams have been identified by our federal and state officials as in peril of breaking up, and like we saw with the Orwell Dam in California, flooding downstream communities. We have networks of pipes for our water supply, which are over 100 years old, which are leaking 10 billion gallons of drinkable water every day into our communities. We have an electric grid which is highly unreliable and which is recognized by our security people at the federal, the state, the local levels as easily being attackable and plunging our entire nation into a chaotic situation. That similarly goes for our air-ground support on controllers on airports and the like. This is not something that is opinion, because it has been documented by the engineers who build these systems and by the engineers who maintain them. So we have had a government that has chosen for real political reasons not to raise taxes. The federal gas tax, which is 18.4 cents a gallon, has not gone up since 1993. It's not gone up a penny. But in order to maintain moderately roads and bridges, the federal government quietly has had to put in $160 billion over the last 10 years from our Treasury. Now, if that's not a testament to the recognition of the size of the peril, you only have to realize that when we travel our roads, the average car owner pays over $400 a year for damage to the car because of potholes and roads that are not passable. So everybody is paying for this. Not to mention, we use our roads and our bridges to transport from the interior of our nation products that are global. And when those products, those deliveries are delayed or otherwise cost more money because of impassable roads, the price of those products goes up and makes it commercially untenable to compete on the global world marketplace.
Yeah, we just heard from Greg DiLoretto from ASCE, past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and Greg kind of went through the math and what it means to average American families in terms of what it does to their budget. So, and you just said a moment ago, Barry, how the recent administrations, plural, have kind of kicked the can down the road. So it's not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's not an other issue. Whatever way people lean politically, we heard from Joe Kennedy in his response last night that there's a goal of roads and bridges that will not rust away. Dick Durbin, I saw his comments, and in part, he said, and I'm sure you've seen, Barry, if the president chooses to follow through on his prepared remarks tonight, he will find Democrats ready to work with him on making massive new investments in America's crumbling roads and bridges. There's roads and bridges again. Chuck Schumer wasn't as positive. But anyway, understanding that ideas and feelings are different than actions and progress, what did you make of President Trump's remarks, even though there wasn't a lot said? And what about the surrounding buzz in the past 18 hours regarding infrastructure? What are your takeaways?
Well, there is a very marginally prepared plan that the administration has put out in support of his, offering of a $1.5 trillion. What it says is a plan that is a wish list without recognizing the enormous challenges of funding a national infrastructure program. He talks about most of this $1.5 trillion is going to come from private funds. He would like to see a lot of it be state and local funds because he's properly recognizing the federal government no longer can afford by itself to fund what is needed, which is essentially a $4 trillion effort to bring our existing facilities up to standards. So from there, you start to realize that this administration has yet to sit and talk to the people who have been struggling with this issue for decades and who understand the nuances. Private equity, in other words, infrastructure funds that might be offered by companies, by banks, by lenders, are not going to come into a program unless they can be assured of a steady, fair rate of return and an agreement that whether it's tolls or some other mechanism from the government is going to be secured to make it safe for them to make that investment.
So are you a supporter of public-private partnerships?
Oh, I think not only a supporter, but I think it is essential that we find the way to make some portion of our needed investment infrastructure come through public-private partnerships. The problem has been that neither the state nor the federal government has created a model that defines how they're going to seed those investments with federal funds, with state funds, and with private equity. Because one thing we have to be careful about, past efforts to turn over roads and bridges, but essentially toll roads, to these private equity investors have largely met with real serious problems. In Indiana, the home state of Vice President Mike Pence, has had a $12 billion disaster when they turned this over. They took money from these private equity in order to shore up their state bridges and roads and other infrastructure. But then once they turned it over, there was not a profit to be made, so the private equity people walked away, and the state had to take it back. We've had other instances like that around the country because they have not created a model that makes it clear how this can be done smartly, nor has the Trump administration set that out. It's almost like they're going to let's look at every deal, we'll try to make a deal on every one. You cannot fix our infrastructure that way.
You've called for a head of the infrastructure department. I think at one point I heard you refer to it kind of as an infrastructure czar.
What I am referring to is the fact that up to now, our nation has largely addressed, except for the interstate highway system from 1957, and except for the Erie Canal, and except for the Intercontinental Railroad, except for those kinds of enormous infrastructure outlays by the federal government, largely infrastructure issues, airports, ports, water systems, electric grids, roads, bridges, tunnels, have been state or city funded. In other words, it came through a local government. In years past, the federal government provided an 80-20 split, with the federal government giving 80%, or in some cases 90%. That has stopped and come to a halt largely over the last 10 and 20 years. States are largely funding many of their infrastructure projects by themselves. And what this means is that 30 states in recent years have raised their gas taxes on their own. State gas taxes have been raised and approved bond issues by the citizens of those states for designated transportation projects. So when we now talk about projects that are of this nature, most projects cannot be done any longer on an individual state or city local basis. They are regional problems because expanding a highway in one state has implications into the states on all sides of it. Doing an airport has to involve roads coming in and out of that airport that involves regional areas. And so what I've called for is a national infrastructure czar who can make decisions that are regional in nature without getting involved into the petty, small-time politics of local cities or politics and local processes in states where mostly there's often a lot of trade-off to campaign contributors to build a road to their shopping center down the street. That's not what we need right now. We need smart solutions to what are regional problems, and that's how we're going to have to approach our growing infrastructure needs.
I guess I'm going to place myself in the optimistic camp for now. Call me tomorrow, and maybe I will change my opinion. But do you think any kind of adjustments, any kind of agreements, I'm looking for the words here, any kind of negotiation could occur that could keep this infrastructure plan moving forward? Because it's got to be done, Barry. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but something has got to be done. Just look at U.S. bridges alone. Just stop there.
Well, Bill, we have to have a change of attitude. Historically, in this country, every time we did an infrastructure program and the government invested in it as debt, the government does so without any interest on its money. So that debt to fund the interstate highway system, the Erie Canal, the Hoover Dam, TVA project, etc., all that was repaid over a period of 25, 35, 40 years. It got all repaid, and the imposition of that debt on our total economy, on our GDP, on our deficit, became a non-issue. Moreover, as I've said all around this country, every time we spend $1 billion on an infrastructure program, we add 10 to 13,000 high-paying jobs. And when you pay out $1 billion to those jobs, the people who receive them, the workers, immediately are paying back 10, 20, 25, 30% of that in the form of state and federal taxes. So it doesn't cost $1 billion, it only costs $700,000. But then they take that money that's left over and they go into their communities and they buy clothing for their children. They buy a new or a used car. They spend money because they were previously either had lesser jobs or no jobs. And the turnover of that money in the communities makes this program deficit neutral. Now, there's a lot of people in Washington who understand this, but politically can't go along with it. They're worried about their reelections. We need a different thinking on the gas tax, which hasn't been raised. There's a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle who would like to see the federal tax raised. Raise taxes, you're going to go to jail. You're going to have a primary alternative posed when you come up for reelection. They're scared to death of that. Well, there's something wrong when those kinds of problems are staying in the way of correcting our perilous infrastructure.
I'm going to steal one of your examples. This country, back in 1969, sent a man to the moon. And I would suggest that this country should be able to keep bridges from plunging into rivers in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and elsewhere. But I think I speak for many people in saying that it is just absolutely unfathomable to me that action's not being taken. And I don't care who's on Pennsylvania Avenue. Something needs to be done. And on behalf of our audience, Barry, we do appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Well, I'm glad to speak with you and all your listeners because, as I say often, this problem is a real American problem that needs an American solution. And it's like apple pie, motherhood, baseball, football, and it has nothing to do with political solutions if you want to make it happen, because everybody understands it, but people got to let go of political influences and lobbying groups and just get started, and let's get going on it. It's long overdue.
I don't say this lightly. If you and I allow this problem to linger, to grow, to go unfettered, sure, we can go ahead and point our fingers at Washington, D.C. You can look at your respective state capital and you can point there, but we all share the blame if this continues. Don't just tweet and post in Facebook. let your voice be heard. We're trying to do that here at the Big Bit Theory, trying to stay on this topic and keep it out in front of people, because it's time for, and I apologize, it's time for the rubber to meet the road. So there you go. What a light and relaxing topic to get season 4 of the show off and running, right? We tried to keep up with our emails over the break, and by the way, keep them coming. When we go national, it's going to help Jim and I, the rest of the team, put together our business plan. I'm at bcolhane@bidprime.com. Jim's email is jward@bidprime.com. So go ahead and update your contact list. TBBT's Twitter is at The Big Bid Theory. On a more personal note, I'm contract_hunter. JW is at JimWard6. That's Jim Ward and the number 6. And as many of you know, we're on Facebook as well. So many thanks again to Mr. Barry LePatner. He's been a busy guy today, and do so much appreciate, again, able to fit us into his schedule. For the Jim Ward, since Jim is in Madrid, hola desde Austin, Jim. Lauren, come back soon. And Rick, glad to have you. Never leave us. And Rick's shaking his head. So hold on tight, folks. Season 4 is going to be great. Go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs. And we wish you all the best in growing your business.
We're having so much fun.